Okay, welcome to our Eid of Shabbat Friday, Parashat class, Perashat Lekh, Lekha. Exciting parasha. We meet Abraham Abinu, and we're taken on a journey through a large part of his life and some dramatic, amazing episodes in Abraham Abinu's life. And the question today is, how far will HaKadosh Baruch Hu go to test you? And what is your level of expectancy in passing? We are all aware of the 10 tests of Abraham Abinu. In fact, interestingly, there is way more than one opinion. And if you add them all up, you come up with somewhere around 15 or 16 possible tests. Be that as it may, there are certain tests that are unanimous. And one of course, we know the Lekh Lekha test, the Brit Milah test, Akedat Yishak test. But one of the unanimous tests are found in our parasha, in Perek Yudalet. It's most of chapter, in fact, it's all of chapter 14. And in that is the test of the Great War, the World War, you can say. A war in which an alliance of 5 great kings, powerful nations, fought an alliance of apparently an even more powerful group of kings and empires of 4 nations. And the 4, led by Kizor LaOmer, were victorious over the 5. Of course, the important part of this episode and the reason that it was demonstrated and informed to us in the book of Bereshit and Perashat Lekh Lekha is because of Abraham Abinu's role. In the aftermath of the war, Abraham Abinu heroically got together a group of 318 men, and you could almost say miraculously, in a night ambush, defeated, he killed many of them, he freed his nephew Lot, and he freed many of the captives, and you can say defeated somehow in a heroic act the 4 victorious, the alliance of the 4 victorious kings. Question is this: how can this possibly be considered a test? The implication of the word test is that if you don't pass, you fail. And here, that would be tantamount to saying that if Abraham Abinu did not venture into this, what you can call Rambo-like mission, to take a small group of men and challenge great, powerful armies on his own and free captives, he would have failed the test. If, God forbid, you had a relative who was taken captive by another country, would it be fair to say that you're being tested as to whether you will take a small group of Rambo, brave-like militiamen and ambush that country's army in the middle of the night and free your relative? And if not, you fail. We can very well understand other tests in Bereshit are either circumstantial or they're ordered by God. God tells Abraham, Lekh Lekha, leave your country. God tells Abraham to enter into the covenant of the Brit Milah, the circumcision. God commands Abraham in the Akedat Yishak, the most difficult test in human history. Or circumstantially, we have Abraham found himself in a famine. His wife was kidnapped by a king. He was told to send his son out from his household. His wife passed away and couldn't bury her, etc. These are circumstances or the commands by God. But here, it's completely voluntary. Abraham could make a choice right now to do something about this war result. But if he didn't, he was failing the test. Sounds very unfair. And as usual, the way we have to approach and dig in and try to find the answer to a question is to look into nuances in the text and the Perashat, prompt us to ask questions, which then brings us to the commentaries, which then will trigger a formation of a larger picture that hopefully will then answer our question. So let's go through some of the storyline here, and let's try to pick up some difficulties in the storyline, the text of the story, in the Perashat, in the terminology, And hopefully that will begin paving our path to resolution and to clarity. So we read the story in the aftermath after Kedor Laomer was victorious. And it says that the other armies ran away to the hills. And about the victorious ones, that alliance of the four kings, it says, they took all of the property and the wealth of the defeated armies. To the victor goes the spoils. Interestingly, it also says they took all of their food, Vayelechu, and they left. Pay attention to that, put it in the back of our memory for a moment. The next pasuk, Vayikhu et Lot v'et rechusho ben achi Abraham vayelechu. Amongst those that were taken, seems to be a captive of war, which also seems to be conventional, is Lot, the nephew of Abraham, took all his wealth, and they went. V'hu yoshev b'Sdom. However, it adds on one description that seems to be unnecessary, and that is that he, Lot, was living in Sodom, which we already knew from a prior story, this parasha, when Abraham and Lot split based on the dispute of their shepherds, and Lot chose to live in Sodom. We knew that already. Seems to be unnecessary. The next pasuk says, "Vayabo hapalit vayageh la'Abraham ha'ibri." The palit, which is someone from the defeated armies, seemingly came and told Abraham about what happened. However, he calls him, and this is the only time he's called this, Abraham ha'ibri, the Hebrew, so to speak. That's who he was addressing. Curious, why is he being called that at all, but especially at this juncture? And he told him about the incident. Abraham heard, of course he heard, he was talking to him. He heard that his brother, it's not his brother, his nephew, was taken captive. He prepared, or he armed Hanichav, which says here, Yelidei Beto, the people of his household, the people that were within his estate, amongst them slaves, students, guests. But they're called here, an interesting word, Hanichav, which is a funny word to use when speaking about the people of his household. In any case, it says there was 318 of them, and they took a strategic route, and in the middle of the night, they ambushed the four kings, the alliance, and they defeated them, they killed some of them, they chased them, and Abraham retrieved Lot and some of the captives and their property, and he came home to a parade's hero, and he passed the test. Let's retreat right now and follow up on some of these curious phrases that we noticed and start to build a picture that is really the reality of this story. So first of all, we said that the armies took their food. Now we know to the victor goes the spoils. So it's all is fair in love and war, and it's accepted internationally speaking from ancient times to modern times that when you win a war, some of the property and the surroundings become yours and you take them. So took their belongings, but then that pasuk added, they took kol ochlam, all their food. Now this, my friends, is something that we can say is completely unconventional. And especially in a time and place where there was no refrigeration, there was no preservative, right? If you take someone's food, you don't just go to the local grocery and restock. It simply means people have no food, which of course translates tragically into starvation. This seems to be an act of cruelty. The next pasuk tells us that Lot was taken, and unnecessarily the Torah informs us who Yoshev B'Sdom, he was living in Sodom, which we knew that. The Nesiv and the Emet Avad explains that, of course, that's unnecessary. But this is to tell us that Lot was not on the front lines, not a soldier, rather who Yoshev B'Sdom. He was simply residing there. He was no more than a resident. And do we know what that means? Of course we do. It means amongst the captives were innocent men, women, and children who were simply residents. They were not soldiers. They were not those who would fairly be taken as war captives. They were bystanders. They were innocent citizens and residents living in their home, taking captives, more accurately, kidnapped. We start to paint this picture now, what we see is what we would call in late modern day atrocities of war. Inhumane activity and behavior by this victorious alliance of armies. And that should be unacceptable at any time and place in world history. Now let's move on as we begin to see what's really happening in this aftermath of the war. And the Torah tells us, Vayabo hapalit. What's the word palit mean? We visit the Aramaic explanation Unkilus, and it tells us, Meshezaba, he who was left over. It also, lefleta, the word in Hebrew means something that is remaining, left over, i.e. a survivor of the war. Rashi tells us it was Og. Other Mefarshim tell us it was someone substantial. And therefore, what we can imagine here is happening is that there is some officer of the defeated armies who survived, who is perhaps injured, and somehow drags himself, who knows, some distance, some miles away to the house. How'd he know? It was his house, but to the house of Abraham Abinu. And he comes, we can imagine, with some entourage of other soldiers, perhaps neighbors in the area, as they saw the scene unfolding, gathered around as well. And he came and he addressed and informed, the Torah tells us, Abraham ha'ivri, Abraham the Hebrew. And that brings us to the famous Midrash. The Midrash that offers several possibilities as to why Abraham is described as the Hebrew ha'ivri. Some say because he came me'ebed, Ebed, the other side of the river. Some say from the lashon of the language he spoke, Ibri. And some say, Kol ha'ulam kulo me'ebed ehad, hu me'ebed ehad. The other side means that the entire world stood on one side and he stood by himself. He was a Renaissance man, a man of God, a man who rediscovered God, who brought the ideas in the name of God back into the world, who infused godly values into his surrounding neighbors and cities and people, who recruited other students, we can call them, under the wings of God, and preached a life of morality, of ethics, and of values in the world of God. He stood by himself. The Sforno tells us, Abraham ha'ibri, they didn't even know that necessarily Lot was a nephew of Abraham. But what they did know that Abraham is a descendant, and this is another explanation in the Midrash, of Eved. And Eved famously was a man of God, a philosopher, and a man who was unique and special and godly. And that was known. Abraham being his descendant was known, and what Abraham stood for was known. And now, if we try to connect the dots and paint the picture more broadly, we see a scene that can unfold as follows. A knock comes on the door of the famous and prestigious Abraham Abinu. And all those around gather to see this dramatic scene. And the officer of the defeated armies then is greeted by Abraham and informs Abraham of the atrocities that are going on. And if we can imagine for ourselves for a moment what that declaration, what that speech looked like to Abraham Abinu, it would say as follows: Abraham ha'ibri, you have spoken and preached and presented yourself as a man of God. You have taught others and become known for a man who guides us to live in a life of godly values. You've modeled what morality means. You've become the paradigm of ethical behavior between man and fellow man. You brought God down to the world. Right now, surrounding you is the antithesis of that. People are suffering. There's ungodly behavior going on. There are atrocities and tragedies in your midst. Abraham, the preacher, the teacher, and the model, ha'ivri, what are you prepared to do? And suddenly, the story takes on an entirely new light. Suddenly, the test becomes clear. It is not necessarily a test. Will someone risk their lives on a very against all odds mission? Rather, will someone, particularly Abraham, our father in this case, be willing to stand up for what he believes and he teaches? Will he, so to speak, put his money where his mouth is? And will he stand for what he has proven to be a man of justice? As we'll see in next week's parasha, he even challenges God. And he tells him, "Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat." Will not the king of the world and the judge of the world mete out justice? He insisted upon justice in a world of God. And he preached that to be a mode of godly behavior. Will Abraham Abinu now be willing to take some action, to put himself in some form of risk in order to pursue justice, to stand up for godly values, and not just to speak, but to actually take action in terms of defending what he believes? The test is now crystallized and the challenge is now clear. And to that say all the commentaries unanimously, this measures up as clearly one of the 10 tests of Abraham Abinu. His reaction, let's continue. The next pasuk, Vayishma Abraham, of course he heard. He was listening to the conversation. But of course here it means that he understood. He immediately was privy to the challenge at hand. The test was clear, and he took action immediately. Vayishma Abraham ki nishba achiv. It's not his brother, but it might as well be his brother, because right now everyone's my brother, says Abraham Abinu. And his reaction, the action he took, vayarek et hanichad. He armed his family, his entourage, his residents, the people of his household. Why is it using this word hanichav? Ibn Ezra says, well, it's from the word chinuch. Chinuch means training or education. Those who trained for war, those who trained for other tasks, or how about just his students? Because everyone within the estate and the world of Abraham were his students. And at this point, if we can be creative and paint the picture a little more graphically, we would see as follows. Abraham Avinu gathers the 318, whoever else was amongst those who he had, mind you, he had no children and grandchildren at this point, who he had recruited and brought under his fold to this point. He put them in the meeting room and he told them as follows: men, we have been studying, we've been growing, we've been learning, we've been talking about God and what it means to have a singular, prime, all-controlling God, what godliness looks like in this world, what morality, ethics, and justice should be. I've been teaching and preaching, you've been listening and learning. But my friends, my students, there comes a time where you have to act on what you believe. That time is now. It's right now that our God, whom we believe in, is testing us and challenging us to heed the call and to take up arms and to practice what we preach and what we believe in, and to defend the values of God in this world. This is our call, man. This is the time. Let's do it. And do what they did. And with the divine assistance of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They pulled off the impossible, miraculously defeated those armies, retrieved the captives, saved the starving, gave back the property, saved his nephew Lot, and of course, in the aftermath, was recognized by not just the defeated armies, but many other world leaders, and elevated the name of God so much more. Indeed, the War of the Kings and Abraham's heroic acts was a very directed and specific test to Abraham Abinu, but a test to all of us in our lives who all stand for Torah and godly values, who all have our standards of morality and ethics, and often are challenged in our lives, sometimes on a bigger stage, and sometimes to a smaller degree, and constantly being asked by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to please be willing to defend those values, and sometimes not just to talk, but to take action as well. Abraham Abinu was our model for that great dictate and the expectations we have in our lives to live godly lives. He passed with flying colors, and B'ezrat Hashem, we always will as well. Shabbat Shalom.